Growing up, I was the weird girl. I was raised by my single Russian immigrant mother who put me into Catholic school even though I'm technically Jewish. I only spoke Russian at home and only started learning English in kindergarten, so I'm pretty sure my Russian accent was so thick that none of the other kids ever understood what I was saying. But when I came home, I practiced the language I knew most freely: music. When I lost myself in violin, piano, and song, no one had to understand but me. My parents, who were both recent immigrants, divorced when I was 4, and I was left to live alone with my mom. She taught me many valuable things, such as how to be resilient by example, but growing up with her was hard. She had been through a few unsuccessful marriages and carried the baggage of her life in communist Russia into the way she parented, taking her pain out on me. Her mental illness led to an unpredictable temperament, and though I was bullied frequently in my elementary and middle school years, she became the worst bully I knew throughout my childhood. But this is not a story about pain. This is a story about learning to heal myself, finding my voice, and how creativity and countercultural communities changed my life. Once I lost my thick Russian accent, I made a few friends, but I was still a pretty lonely kid. One advantage to this was that I had a lot of time to explore my inner world. I wrote entire fantasy novels in wide-ruled notebooks, climbed the large evergreen tree in my front yard, and painted on any scrap pieces of paper I found. When I started middle school, I spent more and more time singing, teaching myself ukulele, and writing poetry. This whole time, I didn't think I was lonely. Growing up in Tacoma, Washington, the better Washington, the trees were my friends. I learned to feel small in the most beautiful ways and turned to nature for guidance as I grew older. I often think about how I don't know if I would have survived my mother's emotional and psychological volatility during those middle and high school years if both music and nature had not played such prominent roles in my life. I lived walking on eggshells, constantly afraid of angering her and causing another eruption. I was afraid of her verbal and emotional attacks, her insults, her name-calling. I felt worthless and unloved and struggled with OCD and depression. Home became a metaphor, a concept I tried to carry with me rather than a physical place. I was afraid of being there and often wished I could die. Worst of all, there was no one I could turn to. I lived alone with her, and I didn't know who to tell. But I learned to escape, and I often hid in the forest near my house. Sometimes I would make music there. I remember distinctly this moment once. I got lost in the music, singing loudly and playing ukulele among the trees, and momentarily felt free of it all. Music helped me forget. When I started high school, I taught myself guitar and kept singing. It was during this time that I met my first role model, my English teacher, Mrs. Coyne. One day I opened up to her about my childhood. I never cried that much in front of an adult. I will never forget the way she looked into my eyes and told me I would heal from my trauma one day. She said I was one of the most resilient young people she had ever met, and that she couldn't believe I had gone through all of this alone until now. This conversation marked a turning point in my life. I started to realize I had power over my life and its trajectory. Coincidentally, she also showed me the Beat Generation. Who were the Beat Generation, you might be wondering? They were a group of revolutionary poets and intellectuals that wrote disruptive countercultural writings in the 50s that would lead to the ideologies that formed the hippie movement in the 60s. Kerouac wrote about wild adventures hitchhiking across America. Kesey wrote about society eradicating unique, radical individuals. And Ginsberg wrote liberating poetry critiquing the status quo. I had never read anything that resonated with me as much as their writings. I felt like the beats had the potential to set me free. So I delved deep. I always knew I didn't want to lead a mainstream, conformist life, and pushed back against both parental and societal expectations. I began to realize that I, too, wanted to create my own counterculture. Everything in my life was leading up to what I call my big life change. That summer, I went backpacking through Olympic National Park. I ended up meeting the friend I consider to have had the most impact on my life to this day. Estelle, who was from Portland, Oregon, taught me to be comfortable with expressing my most genuine and authentic self. She opened my mind to a completely different way of viewing the world. After the trip, I began to own that I was different. I started practicing positivity, walked down the streets singing, and interpretive danced in the forest. I chose to spend time alone and reflected deeply. I shared my music and poetry with people and read about Taoism and Buddhism and the universe. I asked myself who I wanted to be and worked towards becoming that person. So with the courage to become the most authentic version of myself, I headed to Georgetown. Looking back, I don't believe I was meant to go to college here. But in some ways, I believe I was brought here to learn not only to find community, but also to create it. The East Coast was a complete culture shock. On the West Coast, you can make friends with people randomly on the street, and most everyone is creative and outdoorsy. Georgetown, in contrast, felt competitive and cold. I missed Washington so badly, I asked my friends back home to send me evergreen tree seeds to plant around DC. But I wanted to give the East Coast and Georgetown a chance. As a freshman, I started hosting tea nights. I would invite people I had met all around campus to my small dorm room, where we all crammed together and drank tea, played games, ate food, and jammed with musical instruments. Even though I was trying to create this space, I didn't know many other musicians, and I felt like I was losing my creative side. But everything began to change the late spring of my freshman year, when I discovered Gucci, the creative collective on campus, and Derek Little's Art Beyond the Margins open mic events. Finding music and creativity again felt incredibly healing after a year that had been empty and lonely. After feeling inspired by these healing communities, I knew I wanted to create communities for others too. My sophomore year, I hosted music nights and jam sessions in my apartment, and these continued into junior year, when me and my apartment mates hosted open mic nights and collaborative art-making events. I saw so clearly that it is in those moments, when we look at each other for who we truly are and share our art and put down our phones, that we see the truth, the pain and the joy in ourselves and the people around us. Many freshmen told me they had hated Georgetown until they found this community. Hearing this, I was reminded of my freshman self. It's so powerful that we can change people's lives just by giving them a community to feel deeply a part of. With some experience in creating countercultural communities, I headed abroad to Copenhagen junior spring. There, I fully realized my passion for alternative communities. I was living down the street from Christiania, one of the most famous intentional communities in the world, where people lived on the land and houses they had built up themselves, creating art and music and spending time gardening, cooking, and connecting. I loved the communal way of life and resonated deeply with it, having spent time on other intentional communities in the Pacific Northwest. I knew I wanted to delve deeper. I spent the past summer living on and researching 2 different intentional eco-communities, one in India and one in Berkeley, California. It was so amazing to meet people from all over the world who valued living sustainably in community enough to give up their lives in conventional society for it. It was especially powerful being able to return to the West Coast again and spend time dancing in the forest, feeling so genuinely part of something bigger than myself. With the tools of manifestation and intentionality in hand, at the end of the summer, I realized I had done a lot of healing. It was the first time I wasn't the one working to create community. And I felt so inspired to work on my inner self, all while surrounded by other people who were also working on themselves. All who wanted to road trip, living in converted vans, work for the Forest Service, and start their own communes, just like I did. We as humans are social beings. We are meant to live in community with each other, and to know each other, and to look into each other's eyes, and hear each other's stories, and learn from each other, and see each other for who we truly are. We are not meant to live isolated lives. But somewhere along the line, we forget that community has the power to heal us. And most importantly, we forget that we all have the power to create healing communities for each other. We also forget that we are resilient beings. Our bodies can experience standing on the edge of the world on a mountaintop with our palms to the sky one moment and hiding curled up in the closet from the screams of a parent the next. This is the definition of resilience. That the pain we once held in our bodies is also the same pain of which we can be freed. I would wager that this is the most beautiful part of being alive. So what makes you feel alive? Think about it. Do a lot more of that. We drive the steering wheel that is our life. We can choose our own trajectory. Here's a poem about my own trajectory. When I was 7, I used to think people were born kind, brought into life already full of the world, and at age 10, I was afraid. I longed for kindness, but all I had was fear that told me to make a home in my own head. Because we grow up so intricately shaped by the unchanging circumstances of our lives. At age 12, I saw a girl my age introduce herself to the woman beside her on the plane. She was friendly and warm with shared smiles and life stories in the cramped airplane exit row. I wasn't like that, but I wanted to be. I wanted words to drip liquid sweet off my tongue like milk and honey. Every day an adventure, every day exciting, so don't laugh, but I read an article called How to Be Positive. And I listened, and every day each negative thought was forced positive. Twists and turns in the story, changes in the picture in my head to make it better. After a while, the world was exciting, and I, a cosmos, in its own universe. Talking to people on the street, everyone a potential friend, a connection waiting to happen. Seattle buses and Portland coffee shops, and I wasn't scared anymore. 4 years later in my cognitive science class, I realized I had been retraining my brain the entire time. So while the world hands us pain and trauma that stays with us for lifetimes, we must work to open our minds and realize our beauty. We are beings of the ether, belonging to each other, but first and foremost to ourselves. So become the person you want to be. Hike the Appalachian Trail, live in a commune in Europe and then in rural Iowa. Travel and engage every person around you, and most importantly, open your eyes to the world. Get off your phone and be present in this moment, the moment of your life, and the only moment you will ever have. Hit reply to face-to-face interactions and the beauty of everything around you. This, right now, is real. So do all you can to love unexplainably, uncontrollably, and unforgettably. And then set yourself free. My challenge to you is to realize that we all have the power to live lives we are happy with just by delving into what we really love and by being and becoming our most genuine selves. Through healing, we take one of the biggest steps we can to change the world. And we don't have to change the world in big ways. Hold the door open for that girl or compliment someone's pants. Smile and laugh and sing and take time to acknowledge the present. We carry the world in the smallest and most surprising of ways. So, persist and resist. Persist through pain by turning to passion. Know that the healing process takes time, and resist the status quo. Be so authentically, genuinely, and radically yourself that you are left with no other option. Thank you.